I'm really excited to be here with you all today, and I'm excited to talk about adding REST capabilities into a Django app. So first, let's talk a little bit about what we're going to try to accomplish today. We have, or I should say, I have an application that we have written as one of the apps we've used in teaching Django to students at 1150 Academy that is basically an 11 or an Evernote clone. And so adding an API to this would be a pretty cool feature that I thought would be easy for us to cover in a 1-hour webinar here. So the code repository for it is actually up on GitHub. And I assume these links will go out with the notes to everyone and the recordings. But you can actually see the current state of the code. This was originally written back a few years ago with Django 1.8 and Python 3.4, but we've updated it for Django 1.10 and 3.5. Let me give you guys a quick demo of the app itself before we add anything in. So I've got my PyCharm open. I have actually enabled the Django features of PyCharm, so I can basically run my app with a one-button click here, which is really convenient. And it pops open my window now. Let's go over here and launch this. So you already got some in database. Pretty simple. A listing of notes down the side. We can create new notes. And they get saved and shown up on the side here. Pretty easy. Nice little profile page where we can change our password. So that's the basics of the application itself. Let's go back over though. We're going to want to add in some new URLs to this application. So let's kind of talk about designing an API quickly. So we're going to create an API, and we want URLs that look like this. They start with /API, and maybe we want to get all of our notes. And maybe optionally we want to be able to get things like users. So our end goal by the time we're done is to create these kinds of APIs that would respond with a JSON response, all of most REST APIs that you see out there today. So the first thing to do is probably pick a good framework for doing this. There's been a couple out there. Originally when I did this training, we picked TastyPy, but since then it seems that the Django REST Framework has kind of become the go-to framework for doing this kind of an operation. It's pretty easy to find. If you search for just Django REST Framework, you'll be able to pick it up. So inside of our application, we're going to add the Django REST Framework and start building our API into our app. What I've got is a standard, Django project here. There is a folder for our apps. So I've got our Note app inside of here. We have our settings split up for like local production common. So, and we also have our requirements. So down here in requirements, I'm going to add in the Django REST API, or Django REST Framework, sorry. And we'll save that file. Now the first thing to do with the Django REST Framework is actually to create a serializer so that your models, in this case our note model, can be serialized back into different kinds of formats. So inside of our application, we will create a new Python module called serializers. And we'll go ahead and add this into our Git repository. And right away, it's already told us that we've not installed the requirement into our virtual env. So one of the things I really like about PyCharm is it actually manages your virtual environments for your projects. So I'm going to go and click install requirements for us. And you can see down here, it's installing that in the background. Now that it's already installed, I can go ahead and use that in my code. So I'm going to write a note serializer. And I will use the serializers from the REST framework. So if I actually autocomplete this and find REST framework, and there we go, serializer. Now, what we want to do is mimic our model. So I'm going to open up our models, and I'm actually going to split this window over here so I can see my fields on my model and my serializer at the same time, because you'll see that they pretty well mimic each other. So we're going to put the ID in here. So as a return, we want to be able to get the ID, the title, the body, the pub date, and the ID is an integer field. So from the serializers, we can actually bring in the various kinds of fields, and you'll see why this is important in 1 second here. We'll make this one read-only, and we'll add in our title. And you'll notice over here on our model, we have a max length of 200. We'll go ahead and add that same max length over here so that when people are saving their notes back via the API, it can validate and make sure they don't send back too large of a title that we can't support. We'll add a char field for that, and we'll add in our pub date. And that is the extent of our serializer. We can actually test the serializer, and again, I'll show you why it's important. We're going to open up and run the manage PyTask. So as part of the Django add-ons for PyCharm, this will actually look at our manage commands and give us a prompt. I want to be able to run the shell so I can test out my serializer. So we've opened up a Python console as part of the Django shell, and I'm going to import our serializer and our note. Actually, I'll show you that in our database, so I've already got some notes over here. I don't need the models over there anymore. So you can see we've got our database browser built in where we can see the current notes inside the application. Now, if I pull those up over here in the console, first we'll import our notes so we can grab notes, and then we'll import our serializer so that we can see them in the REST API. Note serializer. So first, grab our notes. We'll just grab one note to start with, and then we'll make a serializer that actually can serialize that specific note. So note serializer, and we pass it our note. Now, if we look at the serializer, you can see it's a nice representation of our note. What these serializers allow us to do in the framework is to now serialize or render our note into various kinds of formats. So if you actually would look at the serializer data, the data right now is coming back in a dictionary, but we can actually render that into JSON. So if I do this, REST Framework, renderers, now I import the JSON renderer, I can now get JSON. So if I do JSON renderer and render that, passing it the data, you'll see we get back a byte string that is a JSON representation of our note. Now, we can do this a little easier. You can see that this is basically a lot of kind of copy-pasted code over. The framework actually allows us to leverage the model a little more heavily, kind of like the forms inside of Django. So if I actually change this to not use the serializer, but to use the model serializer, I can use a meta class. So I'll go ahead and get rid of this, and we'll add in a meta class. And we specify the model, and we need to bring in our note, import this. Perfect. And now we could just specify our fields, just as a tuple on here. So we want ID, title, body, and pub date. Now if we restart our shell down here, this should act exactly like our previous one, but with a lot cleaner code. There we go. So we'll do the same thing. We'll just get our first note, and we'll get a serializer. And now if we do s.data, we should see the same thing. Here we go. We've got back our same dictionary, but we've refactored our serializer to be a little, I think, cleaner and easier to understand. And now we're not having to manage the fields in two places, other than just adding them to the list of fields here. That makes it very easy for us to manage. So we've actually seen right away that we can create a serializer and we can render it in JSON. This might be a good point if there were any questions that we could pick those up and answer them if we could.
All right, we do have a couple of good questions. First, this is a question for me. The REST framework, do you know if it generates correct HTTP status codes for things like exceptions in your code and things like that?
Oh yeah, I mean it handles a lot of the nice exception stuff, especially with authentication and permissions. So you'll get 401s, 403s, 500s, and it typically gives you back some kind of a nice human readable version of that exception when you request it.
Yeah, I don't know about you, Calvin, but I'm a man of a certain age, and memorizing HTTP status codes is not in my wheelhouse any longer. John had a good question about dry, the don't repeat yourself principle, and he pointed out in serializers and models, the max length parameter is repeated. Is there a way to do that programmatically or some other way so that you don't have to update two files, he asks. But maybe there's a different point that serializing and database model are two different functions.
Right. So actually, what I just brought up here in the Python console at the bottom, if you use the model serializer, it will pick up from your model those exact same like specifications. So you can see here that it actually does have the max length 200 that it got from the model. I didn't have to specify it again, which is why I like using the model serializer over using just a straight up serializer. But the flexibility you get with the standard serializer is you have ultimate control over what you want to produce and then later serialize or render. So yeah, you can avoid repeating yourself, which is this whole model serializer.
All right, cool. Next question, Marius asked about the database tab. And the database tab is basically JetBrains data grip product, which is our IDE for databases. It's bundled into PyCharm Professional. And Marius asked if there's a way to use it with a remote database. Can you click on the plus sign?
Oh, absolutely. So yeah, if you go up in
show
here,
adding a data source like, yeah, right, there you go, perfect. These are JDBC data sources, and you can configure them, the parameter, connection parameters and everything.
Right, yeah, it's really flexible. You can even start remote Django instances too. So not only can you control a remote database, but you can also control a remote Django instance if you don't have it actually running on your local machine.
All right, and last question is kind of admin. David asked if the example code will be available afterwards. I guess this is related to the course you teach.
Yes, actually, you know what? I forgot to create a branch for this. So I'm going to create a branch for the API enhancement. That way I can push up these changes and then we'll merge it down to master. So we're going to go ahead and create that branch. You can see here that it created it. Now my code's sitting over here. So if we actually wanted
to. But afterwards, when we send everybody the follow-up and on the blog post about this, if you can give us a link to how people can go and look at your Evernote clone.
Yes. Yeah, that's all on GitHub in public right now. So this will be, I'll push these changes up after the webinar.
All right, thanks. All right, that's all the questions for now. Now on to the next section.
Sure. So we're going to talk about actually producing the view or the REST API endpoint at this point. What's nice, again, I mentioned with the serializers is you can now get the data in JSON. So we showed rendering it in a JSON renderer right there, but they're not limited to just JSON. JSON's built in, but it also provides an HTML interface to your API, which I'll show in a bit. But there's actually third-party add-ons that allow you to render into YAML, CSV, XML, even message pack are all things that are available. But what we need to do now is we actually need to hook up our URLs and our view, or create a view that's going to use our serializer now. So we're going to go ahead and open up our views. And at the very end of our view, we'll be able to add in a new API view. And that's actually a decorator built into the REST framework. So if I do this again, we can import that. And now I can do a function-based view for our notes list. And for this, we basically will bring in our notes again. So kind of like we did in our terminal example. So I'll just do note.objects.all so we can get a listing of all our notes. And we will return. Now the REST API includes a response object that allows us to, depending on the application header sent over or the context of how you're requesting the API, it actually allows it to render it in an appropriate format. So JSON for a JSON request or a HTML response for a web request coming from your browser. So I'll import from the REST framework the response, and then here we'll just pass back our notes. Now the next thing we need to do is actually hook this up to our URLs. And one thing I actually forgot to do is inside of our settings file, we need to import and bring in the Django REST Framework app. So it's actually called REST under Framework. So we'll bring in our REST framework, and then we'll go into our URLs. I'm sorry, not that one. We want the global URL. So we're going to make these APIs as we look over here. We want them to be from the root of our app. And so we want /API. So I'm going to go ahead and add these in just at the root for simplicity's sake. And we will configure our URL here. And we want to start with API /notes. And we'll bring in our notes list. And so I'll go ahead and import that. There we go. So that imported for us automatically. If I click save, the Django app's actually still running over here in the background. As I've been making all these code changes, it's just been restarting automatically for us, just like if you were running it in a terminal, which again helps speed up development. It's quite handy to have that. If we go look right now at our UI and try and go to our URL, so type error. There's an issue with our current view. If we actually look at it, it says that the note object is not JSON serializable. All right, that seems like a pretty easy one for us to fix. If we come back down here, we really need to use our serializer. So we had created it, we probably should go ahead and use it. So we'll actually do that right now. I should be able to autocomplete that. There we go. And pass it our notes. And now down here, instead of actually passing back notes, we want our serializer.data, just like we did in our console example. All right, let's try this again. And if we refresh, now you'll notice we're getting a different error. It's actually looking, since we're passing in a list of notes, we need to see why we're not getting back a list of items here. So I'm actually going to go ahead and debug this. If I go into the debugger instead of just running my Django instance, I can actually stop here and examine what my serializer or my notes objects are and understand what's going on here and why we're not getting what we expect. So let's go back to our URL again. All right, so we've actually stepped into the debugger. We can step down through and you can actually examine all the way along, which is super handy for debugging, especially REST APIs where you don't have a lot of view necessarily. Now we can see that our serializer is passing back under the data argument the string, which is a traceback. There's a problem here. Now I know is that we need to actually change this to use the mini equal true. And this will tell the serializer that we're actually getting a list of objects and not just a single object. So if we save that, you can see that it actually restarted our debugger for us automatically. If we refresh our page, it should be restarted. There we go. Now we're jump back over into our debugger. If we step down through here and look at our serializer and look at data, we now see we've got a list, a return list, which is going to work a lot better. So let's go ahead and continue the running of that. And you'll see we get a nice, pretty HTML UI to our API. So this is that response from the Django REST framework, giving us back an HTML version of our code. You can optionally ask for the JSON version of it. If we wanted to see the JSON version of it, we can actually use a tool built into PyCharm to do that. So if we come down here to test RESTful web service, you can see we can actually make requests against our application, and it'll use the JSON and API and send the correct headers. So if I click request, oh, we're still using debugger. Let me restart the app. We don't need a debugger right now. And then we'll go ahead and re-request. Hey, there we go. We've got JSON now. So this is a nice, pretty printed JSON with nice colorization. And I don't even have to leave PyCharm to go see it, which is, again, really handy for doing this kind of thing. So now we have our startings of our API. We've basically started off and created our first endpoint of /API/notes. We're getting back JSON. We've got a nice HTML interface to it. This might be a good point actually for us to stop. We're going to need to do a few extra things to actually make this application a little more production ready. So for example, there are no controls here for permissions or security, but we'll get to that in the next segment here. So actually, Paul, if you had any questions, I'd be happy to answer those right now.
All right, the first one's pretty easy. Are you doing Python 2 or Python 3 for this?
Oh, I am doing Python 3. Any new project that I do and get a chance to use Python 3 with, I do. I'm a big fan. I think they've really cleaned up and made right on some, little, not that Python 2 is bad, but I think Python 3 is better.
As far as you're concerned, Django and the major add-on projects like the REST framework, are they doing a pretty good job of staying up to date with Python 3.5, 3.6, etc.?
Yeah, that's one of the reasons I switched from TastyPy over to the Django REST framework, because there was a lot more activity going on in that project. Luckily, with this API add-ons, the TastyPy one and the Django REST framework, it doesn't dive deep into your code, so I didn't have to change much about my own application to add on the API or to take out the old one and put in a new one. It's more of a matter of removing the one app, adding a new app, and then just adapting to their various serializers and views.
All right, cool. This first question is one that you and I talked about as far as the key combination. When you do that cool thing to add the imports on the fly, the key combination for that is basically Alt-Enter, right?
Yeah, I've been using Alt-Enter to import maybe a model or something I've already typed. If I know part of it, I've been using, I've remapped it, the autocomplete, which Control Space. I've remapped it because I use Quicksilver, so that was already my hotkey for autocomplete.
All right. And Ryan, hopefully that answers that. I'll add one more, the inverse of that. Instead of generating an import, removing an unused import, PyCharm has something called optimize imports, which will reformat your unsorted, ungrouped imports into PEP compliant groupings. They're sorted, but it will also remove any unused imports so that you don't have to do that janitorial work. Here's one. I think I'm going to get this question asked correctly. Does the shell take changes when the code is updated as well? I think what you might mean is the run configuration restarts, and I believe that's Django doing the restart, not us, right?
Correct. The run down here is just watching for file changes, and same with the debugger.
Right. So the Python console and the terminal do not restart automatically when the code changes, so you just have to do that yourself.
Right.
This next one, hope you got it. What is the best practice for using the API under view decorator from REST under framework.views or the exact API view from generics, REST under framework.generics?
Well, I'm glad you asked.
So you know the answer?
I do. Well, I do know the answer. That's actually what we're going to cover today. I'm going to be changing from using a function-based view over to a class-based view, and we're going to start using some view sets here so we can take advantage of the default routers and the routing functionality built into the Django REST framework. I think it's much easier. It's kind of like how we refactor the serializer. We're going to refactor the view to give us some niceties, such as registering our routes to our APIs automatically. And so that's something we're going to do next. And these are going to create what are called view sets. And those view sets are actually subclasses of the generic API views, which give you, again, a lot of like nice out of the box code you don't have to write yourself. So a lot of boilerplate gets eliminated by using those generic API views.
All right, great. And you said you're gonna show that?
That is the very next thing we're going to do.
All right, great. Well, got a lot more questions. Sorry. This is one that probably we can handle. The REST client that's built in, does it save a history of requests previously made? It will remember the things that you've typed in recently, but as far as response bodies and things like that, I don't believe it does, but I will get the PyCharm team to correct me if I get that wrong. There might be a logging function. Another one about our REST client sending multiple JSON lines via post. I believe it just has to be valid JSON, right? You can't send two top-level things, right?
But what I am going to show, if we get to it later, is posting a form, for example. So like form formatted fields. So
Right.
I will show that in the request.
Okay, another one about the REST client, which is a popular topic, that does not have a happy answer. Can you use the REST client if your API requires logging in of some kind, has a permission login required?
We will show that too.
What's that?
We will show that.
All right, great.
We were going to create a token-based authentication that we can use with our REST client so that we can actually authenticate.
Good. Let's see. What is the big advantage with Python 3? You have 5 hours to answer this question.
That's for another webinar, I guess. In my mind, the big advantage of Python.
I'm sorry. The person asked a follow-up question: Python 3 with Django.
Oh, Python 3 with Django. I think just being on the latest and greatest, being able to take advantage of new language features. It's nice that Django kind of stripped away that string issue, the byte stream versus Unicode stuff, and tried to normalize that for you. But I want to be future-proof, and I like keeping that stuff up to date and using the best practices for Django.
I'll use this to plug an initiative that Dmitry Filippov and PyCharm did with the Django Software Foundation. We did a fundraiser and we're funding a fellowship for Django 2 to support Python 3 type hinting. So getting the code base to contain PEP 484 type hints and the follow-on PEP about variable type hints and stuff like that, which will help tools like PyCharm and other IDEs to help you code better. So that's something else that can be an advantage for Python 3 in the future. Question about shifting to Python 3 gradually. Got any strategies for that?
It's actually quite easy with Python 2.7. Being able to use the new print statements and importing the Unicode for futures, it makes it really easy. And then when you're ready for that final flip over, kind of that 2 to 3 script can do most of the heavy lifting for you. I found a couple. We've done a couple migrations from 2 to 3 for a couple Django projects, and it's been relatively straightforward.
Okay, last one for this segment. We're talking about REST APIs and we're talking about JSON. Can you get an XML response instead of JSON?
You can. I'd have to add another app that someone has made a add-on for this framework that gives us XML responses. Out of the box, HTML and JSON are supported, but there are third parties for those other formats that might be wanted.
And you just write the same serializers?
The serializer doesn't change one bit. You would just use, I think that response would actually handle the negotiation if you were to send in the application header correctly for XML application/XML, you should get XML back.
The accepts header?
Yes, exactly.
Oh, cool. All right, that's our questions for this segment. On to the things that you're going to show next.
Okay, great. Yeah, so you can see that the serializers are write once and use many, which I really like. Being able to support different kinds of application needs without having to write a bunch of extra code is a big benefit here. So, like I said, we can do better on our current application. We're currently not supporting any kind of authentication or permissions, and we're not taking advantage of that router feature I was talking about from the Django REST framework. So the first thing I want to do is I'm actually going to refactor our view to use class-based views, and then we'll register that view with our router, and then we'll add in permissions. So let's go back over to our views. we're going to change this to be a class-based view now. And we'll just call it our note. Oops. Note view set. So these are called view sets inside of the REST framework. So we'll bring in view sets. Read-only model view set. Here we go. Now, the query we're using here to get notes can actually become our class attribute called query set. And we don't need our serializer in this case. Actually, we're going to use the class attribute for serializer class, and we just give it the name of our serializer class. And this is our complete new view using the class-based views instead of the function-based views. You'll notice that our restart, because I saved the file, is now saying it can't import notes list, so we're going to go fix that. If we go over into our URLs, and we'll bring in, well, first thing first is to actually grab our new router. So we'll delete this old import because we don't need it right now, and we will bring in our router. And that is, again, coming from the Django REST Framework. And we just use the default one. Again, there's lots of options we could use here, but we only need the default functionality at the moment. And we will now take our router and register our view. And so to register the view, we just need our prefix. In this case is going to be our notes is our prefix for this application. And we put in our note view set. And you can see it imported for me nicely. So we've brought in our default router from the framework, registered our note view set in the prefix notes, and now if we come down and fix our URL here, we can change this to actually import and use the automatically generated URLs coming from our router. So we'll change our URL here to be just /API, and then we'll do an include of our router dot URLs. And this should restart, and we should actually be able to go and see our API again. So if we come back in here and go API, you see the API and it gives us our sub. So these are each registered router. There's notes one, and it automatically generates URLs for us based on that prefix. And if I click on it, it gives me a notes listing. Now it's still giving me a note listing for all the users in the system. So you'll see that there's actually a user one vacation notes here in addition to my two notes that are on my account. That'll be the next piece we actually want to fix. So we want to go ahead and change our class-based view now to use the request.user so we can filter our notes just down to only my notes and not all the notes in the system. So let's go into our views. We're going to replace our query set with an overriding of the get query set. So in this case, we can now return our note.objects.filter. And in this case, we're going to filter on owner. And we'll use self.request.user. And I'll go ahead and order these by the publication date, just to make it look nice. Now, why are we doing it like this? Why do we have to override a method of our view set? It's so that we can use the request. So in this case, we want to be able to use self.request.user to be able to filter our notes. When just using the standard query set, we don't have that option available to us as readily available to us because we're not passed into a method with the instance being passed to us. So that's why we're doing this. The last bit we want to do is we're going to start adding in some permissions now. So to add in permissions, we can actually use permission classes as a class attribute and look for is authenticated. Now I'll have to import this from the REST framework. Now we're using model-based permissions on our REST view, and we're requiring that someone is authenticated to actually view the notes. We need to actually enable that for the REST framework. So in our settings, we actually need to add in to the very bottom here, settings for the REST framework to use model-based permissions. So I'm going to copy and paste that in just to speed things up. But here we go. So what I've done is I've actually configured the REST framework using its REST framework settings. It's a dictionary, and one of its keys is the default permission classes. By default, it's allowing anonymous to view all things, but here we can actually change it to use the Django model permissions or anonymous read-only. Now that we've actually required is authenticated with our view, this shouldn't allow requests to API notes from anonymous users. Since we are logged in over here, this should still work for us. Oh, one more thing. When you change your view, so if we go over here to views, and we've changed from using the query set class attribute to using the get query set method on an object or on the class, we actually need to change our route that we registered. It doesn't have enough context in this case to render. And so if we go back up here to our note view set, oh, here it is, route register, we can add a third argument to this, which is our base name. You can see right there in the assertion error, base name argument is not specified. That's the third argument to registering a route is the base name. So let's go ahead and restart the Django app. Sometimes it doesn't pick up the code change. In this case, that should work. Great, our app's back up and running. And if we go to the API/notes, you'll now see that there are only 2 notes here instead of the 3 notes. So it's using the get query set and filtering down on just my name. The authentication is happening because the REST framework by default will use the basic auth or session authentication from Django. So you can see right here, it shows my current logged in name is Calvin. That's coming from the default settings of the Django REST framework for that. We're going to change that up in our next section here to use token-based authentication. Now, if we actually go over here, the REST client built into PyCharm, and try and attempt to get our notes, we'll see we've got an issue. Authentication credentials were not provided. So here's those nice exceptions. We got basically a 403 back from the application with a nice return message about authentication credentials were missing. So this is kind of addressing that first question, or one question about authentication details and the REST client. We need a way now of authenticating people. So to do that, we're going to go ahead and add in the auth token add-on from the REST framework. So the REST framework included an auth token module that we can use for authentication, which gives us the ability to pass in a header, like an authorization header with our token and authenticate users via that token. So let's go ahead and do that. We're going to first into our settings file. So we'll go back over to common. We'll go back up to the REST framework. And we're going to add in another app. You can see here the auth token. So it's already included. We don't need to add any more modules to our requirements.txt file. But we do need to add the app into our third-party apps here so that the various views that handle the token authentication get enabled and made available to our application itself. The last thing we need to do now is we need to override at the very bottom our default authentication classes for our REST framework. But, you know, I'm going to copy paste that in too because it's a little more typing than I'm willing to do for the webinar. So what I've done is I've pasted in the default. So these are what comes out of the box with the REST framework. I'm going to add to that list the token authentication. And this enables that ability to use a token instead of basic auth or a cookie session authentication for us. Now what we need to do is, since we've added in the token auth app, we need to do a database migration. If we look at the current database, you'll see that there's the auth user, but we're missing, well, I guess it's right, it's actually in there. The auth token was added in a previous migration run. But normally what you would do here is you would come into your Django run and you just run migrate. And if there were any migrations to happen, which it should have, there we go, it did run it. I just hadn't refreshed the table list. There we go. So auth tokens are here, but it's empty. We need a way now to get our tokens into our user accounts. We can actually go ahead and generate them for our existing users, and then I'll show you how we can automatically create tokens for new users. So I'm going to close this Django shell and open up a new one. And I'm going to go ahead and copy paste in some code again to generate tokens for all of our users. So I just, oops. Yeah, let me start over on that one. There we go. So I've imported the standard user from contrib and the token from our REST framework, and then I'm just going to loop over each of our objects, or each of our users, creating a token for them. So if we refresh our data, we now see we've got our keys for each of our users, and I'm going to go ahead and show it. We can do user.authToken, and you can see their token right there. So that is, let's see, what's this user? This is my user. So we'll go ahead and use our REST client now, passing in the authentication token. So we can add a new header here. This is how we can authenticate our app using the REST client. So it auto-completes us with authorization. For the value, we specify token, space, and then that actual token. And now if we go request our notes, you'll see we've gotten our notes, just the two of them, and I'm authenticated as my user. And so I can see using my token now, I can actually grab just my notes and everything's working as expected. So there is authentication using notes. Let's see, make sure we're at the right spot there. Oh, so the last bit here is now we've added our authorization. If we create new users, those tokens need to be generated automatically for us. So we want to go into our model, and we're going to add in something to catch that signal of a new user being created. So if we go over to our models, come down here to the end, and we'll add in a receiver of a signal. So we're going to add a receiver. If I could spell, I'm going to go ahead and paste this in because that also will be easier than me trying to type. Here we go. So we've added in a post-save receiver. So I'll go ahead and import these missing imports. And that's what we want. And we'll import our settings, which are missing here, from Django conf. And the last bit is to import the token. And that comes from our REST framework, which is off the bottom here. There we go. So now we should see, if we go back to the run window, it should have restarted for us. If we go into the Django admin, and we can actually see our tokens through the admin as well. Go back up and add a new user. So we'll add in user 3. We should go back into tokens and now see a token for user 3, which we do. So that signal now has been caught. The token functionality of the REST framework has gone ahead and see that the user was created and added a token into their table for them. The last piece of this is if a user is logged in, they should be able to see their token. So if we go up into our templates, I want to go ahead
Calvin, can we pause?
Yeah,
hey, can
absolutely.
we pause there? We've got a good number of questions. If that's okay.
Yeah, perfect.
Is that right?
No, it's a perfect stopping point there.
All right, cool. First, that token stuff is pretty badass.
Yeah, I mean, it makes it super easy.
Yep. And also pasting it into the REST client. That's a good, the HTTP header for the REST client is pretty cool. So related to that, I have a question about different REST authentication mechanisms.
Mm-hmm.
Whether the REST framework or any plugins, add-ons, whatever, can get you OAuth, blah, blah, blah.
Yes. If you go over here into the authentication section, there's some that are third party. So for example, like OAuth, there's a couple of OAuth ones built in here. The basic ones are the three I've talked about though, basic, token, and session. So those are included out of the box. If you want to use additional ones, there are some third party modules available to do that.
Okay. Next, what are the server-side requirements to run Django in a RESTful web service? You can reinterpret requirements to mean suggestions. I know in your full version of this, you have some other components.
Correct. I mean, this will run, particularly when we're using Nginx and uWSGI to run our Django applications. So you could deploy, many uWSGI clients to handle all the various load of the application. It doesn't. I don't think it really requires any kind of special server requirements because this is still just HTTP requests, which is kind of the beauty of REST, and it makes it nice and simple. So it acts like a standard web request.
All right. Next question. Here comes the softball. Here comes the easy cream puff question. What was that Vim style search you just did in the editor, Calvin?
Okay, I will admit I have been using VI since 1993, and it's been hard to switch off of any other editor due to the speed of VI and now Vim. So I actually have been using the VI key bindings inside of the editor here, so I can hit slash and search for, note, or, for example. So I've been actually using all my standard VI key bindings, so I'm right at home. I've switched back into PyCharm because it is so nice. Just that database browser, REST client, running Django, debug mode has made the switch worth it. Plus, it's finally fast enough. I've tried it years ago and it was a little slower, but now it keeps right up with my pace of development, which was my big issue in the past with things like TextMate. We used to do a lot of clone projects, which are very large. We're talking hundreds and hundreds of eggs and modules. And when TextMate would try and index those into a project pane, you could go get a coffee.
In addition to the key bindings for VI, there's also the idea Vim plugin. Naresh mentioned that as well, that Naresh is using the plugin. Are you using the plugin, the idea Vim plugin?
I am using the plugin. Great. I think there's a whole set of settings for it too. If you go down here to other settings, Vim emulation. So you can actually reconfigure certain shortcuts that may already be used inside of PyCharm. I haven't gotten that deep with it yet, other than having to redo the autocomplete one for my Quicksilver conflict.
The author of the idea Vim plugin, or the maintainer, is on the PyCharm team, so we know it works pretty well with PyCharm.
Yeah, it does.
What's the best?
Quite complete.
Yep. What's the best way to keep track of permissions across your project? For example, how could I easily see all views that require the is authenticated permission? In PyCharm, you can go to the permission and do right-click find usages.
Oh, that's true, yeah. Yep, if I go over to views, right now it's only being used here in this one spot. There we go. You can say find usages. So we'd see is authenticated.
Yep.
So yeah, that's probably one of the easiest ways to do it, to use the quick find. Now, this find usages is super handy. I mean, we've got large code bases, and being able to find the usage of a function across all of it, and then you can use that same kind of functionality with the refactor. If you want to rename a method or rename a class, PyCharm will actually rename it all for you.
Yeah, those are the kinds of things that you just use hundreds of times a day. Does token auth help with object level permissions?
Yes, the Django REST Framework does support object level permissions if you use their other add-on. Where is it at? It's mentioned right on the front page in its dependency, optional dependencies, which is Django Guardian. Gives us object level permission support. Can't do that.
All right, here's a question. I'd like to write integration tests to exercise the REST API programmatically. You done much of that?
I haven't actually. But I'm guessing that there's tons of request-based frameworks out there for testing.
Yeah, that is kind of an interesting question. You can go all the way to the point of Selenium WebDriver kind of stuff that exercises all the way to the HTTP connection, but presumably there's a way to avoid all that ceremony and do integration tests without running an HTTP server.
Yeah, we've been using PyTest for a couple projects, and PyCharm supports it really nicely in the debugger, being able to rerun the tests continuously, which is
right. And then being able to, in the GUI, right-click and say run only this one or skip that one, or only show me following things and all that stuff.
Yep, that's big time saver.
Okay, this is a question about REST framework, and I know that there's a lot of projects in the world of Python doing these Swagger kind of things. Is the REST client capable of generating docs for the endpoint?
The REST client, or you mean the REST framework? Sorry.
Yeah, that's a good point. Let's not say PyCharm's REST client. Let's talk more about the REST framework going to a URL.
Yes. So yeah, it does. I didn't put the doc string in here, but if I put a doc string, so I just added a doc string to my notes view set, and then I just closed it. There we go. So it's just restarted. If we come back over here and refresh, you'll see list all the notes for a user. So their doc strings get picked up and put right into the online documentation.
Oh, that's good. I've got two more questions, but would you prefer to go on to your next section from a time perspective?
No, let's answer the two questions. The next section, I'm going to add in the user's endpoint, which we can do really quickly because I've got that code ready to go. And the last thing, if we have time, I was going to show how you can actually request your token over REST.
Oh, yeah. I've done that in Angular before, but I never really thought about the back-end implications of that.
Yeah.
Okay, another question from Narendra. What if we have a custom user model, say a subclass of abstract user or something with a totally new auth backend? Is there anything we need to do differently to integrate it with token auth?
Not with token auth, because token auth is going to be linked to your user's profile. So when you create the token, as long as it's attached to that user, it's going to use the standard, I can't remember what it's called off the top of my head, but there's a setting for what your user model is in Django. It's going to look at that to find the user and find the token auth table.
So as long as your custom user model quacks like a duck the same way as, okay, all right, cool. Can you write login APIs using the REST framework's auth system?
Let's show that. So this is actually how we can. This is how we can actually obtain our auth token. There's one last thing I wanted to show before we get to that, which was inside of our profile. It'd be nice to show people their token. So I've opened up my profile. Go ahead and show you the notes again. On a nickname and password, but they can't see their token yet. This again is a very easy change. We'll just do this. Change this to API token. And as I did in the terminal, we can just search or show the auth token. So if we refresh, we now see here's our API token. So now users can access it. You can add in a button to allow them to change it if it was ever exposed. But now the users logging in through the regular web can actually have access to their API token. What if they don't want to go to their website to see their token? They can actually request it via the REST framework, but we do need to add in the a URL for that. So we're going to go back into our URLs, and it's easier if I just do this. And we'll go down here to API, and we're going to add in a new URL here that allows us to grab our token. So we'll start with API, and this could be anything you wanted. We'll just call it token auth as our endpoint. And we're going to bring in obtain auth token from the REST framework. It looks like it got it for us. Okay, so now we have a new API endpoint. If we go back over here to our REST client, if we put in that as our endpoint dash, let's see here, token auth, and if I click request, you'll see that method get not allowed. Well, luckily we can change over and we can post. And if we post, it's going to give us another error because no, URL doesn't end in a slash. That's my bad for using this like that. There we go. Now we can see that it's actually looking for a couple fields, our username and our password. So if we go into our request and turn on the request parameters for username and password, and then we re-request this again, you can see we can get our token. So that's an easy way if you're writing an application and you want people to log in the first time but then use a token every time after that for all the requests, you can use this obtain auth token view directly to grab your token. Pretty nifty, huh?
Yeah, stop showing off.
All right, since we have I got a couple more minutes, Paul.
I believe you have a couple more minutes and we are caught up on questions, so plow ahead.
Oh, perfect. So the last thing I want to show, which is kind of our initial goal, was we created our notes API endpoint. Let's create a users API endpoint just using the built-in contrib auth users models. What we're going to do is go into our serializer. We're going to create a serializer for our user. So user serializer. In this case, we're going to use a different base class for this, which is the hyperlinked model serializer. And I'll show you why that's really cool in a moment. We will go ahead and do the same kind of thing, use a meta class, and our model will be our user. And we need to import that from contrib. And we'll have fields that we can expose, which will be, in this case, URL. This is where the hyperlinked model comes into play. Username, email, and is staff. All right, we've set up our serializer. Let's set up our view. So we come down here. So Pepe, need 2 returns. We'll do a user view set. And we'll have that also inherit from a model view set. And when we inherit from a model view set, we can actually make our API read-write. So the previous one, we made a read-only. This one, I'm going to show you how we can actually edit through the HTML version of the API. We'll use the permission classes of isAuthenticated again. We will set up our query set to be all users. In this case, oops, user.objects. Oh, I need to import user first. Yeah, that's much better. And we'll set up our serializer class, which is our user serializer. And I'll autocomplete that guy like that. All right, we've got our view, we've got our serializer. The only last bit now is to register with our router. We don't need to actually make any modifications to our API or our URLs list here. The router will actually handle doing that for us. So we'll register an endpoint, our prefix being users. That's what we had typed up in our example. And here we just use user view set. And we save. And Django just restarted for us automatically. If we go back to our view now and go back to our API, you'll now see we've got two endpoints, notes and users. And click on users, you'll see there's a listing of all of our users. The hyperlink model serializer gives us these nice URLs that are ready for us to click on inside the HTML interface. If I, for example, wanted to add an email address to user 4 here, I can see that I can now actually modify this through the web interface, or user 3 at example.org. And we'll put, and if we go back to our listing of users, you'll see that user 3 now has an email address. So we actually have a read-write example API fully documented and produced fairly automatically for us. So that is the adding of our users endpoint. If there's any more questions, I'd be happy to answer them. Otherwise, it's been a real pleasure being here.
All right, we'll go ahead and start the wrap up, but we do have one more question from Katerina. Is it too much manual coding if I just want to create post, get, delete, put, patch? Is there any other way to handle it with less code? For example, I think it's some of those things where you kind of point it at your database model and it generates all your APIs for you.
Oh, yeah. I mean, the closest thing is the fact using those model serializers and the model view sets, or the model, that gives you kind of the most, I guess, automatic experience here. You still maintain control over which fields are exposed. You still get the ability to put permissions on a class base or object base using this. I don't think there's not a magical point at it, and it just automatically generates the whole thing for you. I think you still need to make decisions about your prefixes and your routes, so you can truly design the API and not just let it kind of randomly happen.
There are a number of Python projects out there over the years that have done that kind of thing. That want to make just a quick API pointed at your schemas and stuff, and it'll figure everything out and make all your endpoints. All right, looks like we don't have any more questions right now. If you do have questions later, please don't hesitate to reach out to us by email. Let me go ahead and switch over to my screen. And I'd really like to say thanks to Calvin on this. You did a really good job on this. Presented a lot of information in a nice period of time, fielded a lot of questions. And Calvin, you're available for a follow-up on Twitter and stuff like that, right?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I am not hard to find, and I really enjoyed doing this for everybody.
All right, the slide that I have right now has the Twitter for Calvin. We'll be putting this up later. If you'd like to get more information on PyCharm, please go to jetbrains.com/PyCharm. We really would appreciate to get your feedback on this webinar. Believe it or not, we read it very, very carefully. We'll share some of the things with Calvin as well. So please feel free to send us your feedback on Twitter or in the after webinar survey. The survey is the best way to let us know because we can analyze your points. The recording will be made available on our YouTube channel soon. We'll announce it on our PyCharm blog and on Twitter. The PyCharm blog, you can find up-to-date PyCharm news about releases and events, in addition to educational resources. So for example, the recording of this webinar will be published there in a few days, including links to Calvin's information. We'll also provide some additional links and information from Calvin's presentation over there, I presume including your GitHub URL, right?
Absolutely.
All right. That's everything from us today. Thanks a lot, Calvin, for joining us. Thanks to all the attendees for joining us, and hope you have a nice day.